All right, good evening, everyone, friends, family, administrators, and my students. Thank you for being here tonight at our first annual Capstone celebration at East Ascension High School. My name is Heather Fox, and I have the unique privilege of teaching AP Research here at EA. This isn't just a presentation program. It's a celebration of persistence, growth, and the kind of learning that matters beyond the walls of any classroom. This year, I had the immense privilege of guiding 12 incredibly brave and brilliant students through one of the most challenging academic journeys high school has to offer, AP Research, as their final step to becoming Capstone graduate candidates. Now, I could tell you all about the College Board rubric. I could explain the requirements, the annotated bibliographies, the sleepless nights, formatting citations, and there were many. But tonight isn't about the process, it's about the people. These 12 students didn't just complete a class. They identified a problem. They asked a question that the world hadn't answered, not in the way they needed it to. And then they went out and tried to answer it. They became researchers, they became writers, they became more themselves. In a world that often rushes past nuance, they chose to sit with complexity. In a time when quick answers are everywhere, they had the patience to find meaningful ones. And when the work felt too big, which it did many times, they chose to keep going. Tonight is for honoring that choice. I'm so proud of each and every one of them, not just for their final papers, but for their questions, their grit, and their belief that their ideas matter. It's been an honor to be their teacher, and as cliche as it sounds, these 12 individuals have taught me just as much as I've taught them. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome each student to the stage as we briefly highlight their work and the impact they're already making. So first we have Alex Guillat. Alex challenged the assumption that all students are equally prepared to participate in democracy. His research reveals that gaps in civic education can have long-lasting impacts on students' sense of political agency, especially here in Louisiana. Alex.
Good afternoon. So the official title for my project was Learn Disenfranchisement, Examining Civic Education and Dispositional Outcomes in Louisiana Secondary Schools. So to get into a little bit of context for this research, this whole research process sort of began during the election cycle of the 2024 federal election. And around that time, I noticed that youth lack the political knowledge that's necessary to participate in conversations about civic matters. This is supported by tons of literature, and it really is true that youth civic engagement and public knowledge is at an all-time low. When we zoom in a little bit and look at Louisiana, we realize that Louisiana has the 6th lowest youth turnout in the nation, and this was illustrated by the fact that only 16% of youth voters in Louisiana who are eligible to vote voted in the 2022 midterm election. So I sort of began to explore this interest a little bit further, and I found a research gap, and I started looking at the civics course in Louisiana high schools. So I buckled down on that specific course, and then I looked at a specific aspect of civic educational outcomes, and that specific aspect was civic dispositions. So civic dispositions are the attitudes that students have towards different matters of political and civic life. This can be anything from attitudes towards voting, attitudes towards government, attitudes towards education, and attitudes towards their peers. So understanding what these civic dispositions look like in the real world, I narrowed down these dispositions into 4 different categories. The first category was attitudes towards voting. The second category was the tendency to remain politically aware of your surroundings. The third category was the way in which students perceived the importance of democracy. And then the final category was the civic and moral virtues that students had. So the results of my study are depicted here with this graph. Each one of those categories corresponds to a different suite of outcome items. And then an average score was designated to both civic students and non-civic students. So as you can see, the non-civic students are highlighted right there in red, and the civic students are highlighted in blue. In each category, students who had never began taking civics outscored students who had completed the civics course in its entirety. The most notable finding from this project was the fact that in Suite 1, there was a 0.9 point difference on a 5-point scale that students who never began civics demonstrated a much greater propensity for voting than students who completed the course in its entirety. So, when we began to look at the why, as to why that may be the case, I came across something called external political efficacy. External political efficacy is an attitude that's incredibly relevant to voting outcome. External political efficacy is the extent to which citizens can believe that their government will respond to their demands. So it's reasonable to say that as a result of taking a civics course, students exhibit some diminished level of external political efficacy. So I coupled that finding with some other minor findings from the course. One of those findings were that civic students valued civil disobedience to a lesser extent than students who never began taking a civics course. And also civic students cared lesser for the well-being of disadvantaged groups than students who completed the course in its entirety. And my finding was that civics may negatively contribute to attitudes associated with a life of civic engagement. So what does this mean for the real world? We find that civics may not foster beneficial attitudes, so we need to reform the course. This comes in the shape of implementing some best practices and regulating those attitudes, and then also measuring those attitudes throughout the course to ensure that all students have equitable attitudes that can sustain them through a life of civic engagement.
All right, next up we have Bailey Dugas. Bailey explored how visual marketing doesn't just sell a story, it shapes how teens think and feel. Her research uncovers just how deeply movie posters influence mood, identity, and even expectations before the film starts.
Hello, I am Bailey Dugas, and what I researched was basically the psychological effects of movie posters. What led me to this topic was I've always loved movies, and thinking back to my love of movies, I remembered the time when the movie Black Panther was coming out and how that had a very great appeal to Black audiences. Many Black audiences went to go see this movie, and it kind of got me thinking if there really was some sort of link between the characters that audiences were seeing that looked like them, and if that actually influenced people of this very same demographic to go watch these movies. This led to me thinking about where do we even watch movies, which is streaming, and that led me down a rabbit hole of streaming services and how do they even recommend the movies that we're watching. And I found that in all these discussions and papers about how do these streaming services recommend the movies that we're watching, that many of them didn't really cover the products themselves, the movies. And given the fact that many of these streaming services, such as Netflix, use poster-like images to grab an audience's or viewer's attention to watch these movies, I found that the perfect gap was to look at movie posters themselves and what they represent, and if that can influence adolescents specifically to watch or stream certain products. This led me to a survey that had posters of characters with various ages, races, genders, and even genres. And this was important to me because I wanted my survey to be engaging and essentially something that the adolescents that go to the school would want to answer, and not just the ecological science of watching paint dry. This led me to find some trends, first of which was that when it came to the differences between males watching movies that featured mainly female characters and females watching movies with mainly male characters, that males were 50% less likely to want to watch a movie poster that had only female characters in it, opposed to females watching movies that had only male characters in them. Another trend I found was that both white and Black participants were more likely to watch movies that had posters that did have their demographic. However, Hispanic audiences were 2 times more likely to watch movies that had white characters depicted in them. Another trend I found was that the adolescents who took the survey were much more attracted to movies in the horror genre, opposed to movies in the drama, which in the drama genre, than any other ones. Overall, I think this proves that there isn't a link between the demographics portrayed in movie posters and the teens and whether or not teens will choose to watch those posters. And some future research that I think would be interesting in this field is maybe if there's anything pertaining to movie trailers specifically that there was a link between anything portrayed in those, and if there are any links between if people will want to watch movies based on movie trailers and that sort of thing.
Next up, we have Bree Dudas. Bree examined how Western film shapes not only what we see, but how we see it. Her project reveals how cultural power can be hidden in something as simple and as powerful as the color on a screen.
You were standing in the way. Do you want them? Okay, thanks for your help. Okay, so I looked at the effects of the modern Western film. And for a context of that, I'm not looking at Western films because I realized that that would be confused. I'm looking at American industry. I'm looking at Hollywood and all of that. But the goal of my research was to ultimately do like an advanced color theory. And I wanted to look at color within film specifically and how we don't understand or like the subconscious understanding of we're interpreting this color to feel a certain way. And so that led me to my title of The Effects of the Modern Western Film on the perception of color. So with my research, I really divided it into two sections. The first part that I looked at was movies on their own and how this just impacts not only like our social life, as there's a lot of research that supports that, but I looked too at decision making more specifically, and I really wanted to look at how decisions are impacted and how that goes into like the future of how we live our lives. I then looked into color, and I found a lot of studies that looked at adolescents, so young kids, and how that shapes the world around them really, and how they learn to make decisions and how they learn within like classroom settings. I took the two different ideas and combined them to ultimately get my research question: to what extent does the modern Western film affect an individual's perception of color? For my gap, I initially had no clue what I was going to do for my gap. I went into it and said, I think I'm just going to find it through my research. And I did. I only sent my research out to students within the school. And looking at all the research I had already done, or all the body of knowledge that already existed, I was able to find that adolescents, teens, there was no research really on anything to do with color specifically. Now there was stuff for film, but there wasn't anything for color. And I said, okay, so I'm gonna look and I'm gonna send out my survey, and I got to fill the gap with our high school population. My findings, I was able to find that students who were able to actively see the context of the film. So in my research, we had students who were able to see images from films and students who were only able to see the colors that represented those films. And the students who were able to see the film image in its entirety were more likely to have a stronger emotional connection, and then that in turn changed their opinion for questions they were later asked about color. So the implications of this research is that film has much more of a social impact than we initially believed it has. It impacts very minute details of our lives, especially when you're looking at color. It's something we view all the time, every day, to shape the world around us. And when there's something so influential in media that can change our perception, that's really important, especially when we're looking at the gap that I was able to fill, which is the developing mind of a teenager. For my future research, I would say the one thing I regret and the one thing I would wish that somebody would do is have students or have just your participants view a movie in full length, especially looking at film or anything, video, media, anything like that, because they're getting the full extent and they're getting all the context that goes along with what you really want them to understand, and they're able to place themselves in the context of both the world you're showing them and the questions you're asking them.
Next, we have Cameron Bennett. Cameron took on the media machine, investigating how modern platforms influence teen spending habits.
So my name is Cameron Bennett, and my research title was Contemporary Media and Teenage Consumerism. And so for context, I knew I wanted to research social media and teenagers simply because it was easiest to send out the survey to high school students. And whenever I looked at social media and teenagers, I found that it was used as an advertising tool, and it was also, they examined the effects of social media and teenagers. And so whenever they was looking at it as an advertising tool, they found that it was very influential to use among teenagers, especially whenever it was used ethically and legally in the correct ways. And so I also found that it impacts a lot of teenagers' behavior, such as substance usage, eating habits, fitness, just a lot of aspects of teenagers' lives in general, simply because they are currently developing. And so that led me to the gap, which was that there was no research connecting these two bodies of knowledge. There was no research connecting the use of advertising for social media and teens and the specific effects that came with it, and not regarding specific product behaviors. And so I decided to research my research question was, to what extent is teenage consumerism impacted by social media within teens in Southern Louisiana, and I researched the 5 local high schools. And so through my research, I was able to find that teenagers have very little knowledge of their consumer rights, and because of that, they should be more susceptible to advertising. But my research showed that they've used so much content on social media that they are able to distinguish those advertisements better than if they did have that knowledge of their consumer rights. And so that led me to believe that social media does promote a materialistic mindset among teenagers, but it's generally ineffective simply because teenagers don't have the resources to replicate what they see on social media all the time. And so my directions for future research would definitely be to analyze it from an individual perspective, simply because I was looking at it by grade, simply because that was the best way to separate the groups by maturity and age. But I would have researched it by individuals simply to see how much their time on social media impacts them, or even the platform that they use mainly impacts them. And I definitely think that it implies that advertising would be such a greater tool among teenagers if the advertisements were properly disclosed, as well as just being more individual to appeal to the students' beliefs. And that was all.
So Victor's turn is next. Victor asked a question close to both body and soul. What gets people moving? His study connects physical activity in nature with organized sports and shows how the outdoors might be the key to building healthier communities.
So I decided to examine how hiking frequency, or if hiking frequency, affects sports participation in Southern Louisiana. I wanted to figure out a problem that affected physical activity in students who, not students, I wanted to find a problem that affected people who were not getting enough physical activity to participate, that qualified for the recommended amount of physical activity. Few studies have been done to examine how hiking frequency and sports participation correlate with each other, and fewer studies have examined regions where hiking is not a common physical activity. So I decided to examine these two aspects. I found that there's a weak correlation between hiking frequency and sports participation. This is mainly due probably to many students not having hikes or having hiking experience. And many future studies or future teams could try and encourage more participation in sports, and they could encourage people to participate in different activities to increase their physical activity, which would hopefully benefit their health by decreasing side effects of laziness. Thank you.
Next up, we have Destiny Rubio. Destiny's research gives voice to students navigating family change and highlights the importance of understanding, not assumptions, in supporting their success.
So I decided to do my research on the influence of parental divorce on the educational outcomes of public high school students in South Louisiana. The reason I chose this study was because I know entering high school, especially through grades 11 through 12, it's important for a lot of students because that's when their academic success is linked to their future career and their opportunities. I also chose this because it could lead to important information for a lot of teachers and students and parents to see what effects, especially for parents, to see what effects their divorce could have an impact on their students at home and at school also, and then providing important information to educators and staff and counselors because they could see how they could help the students with this. I also chose this because I personally know friends and family who have experienced these divorce. So the research gap in my thing was that previous research was outdated and then my research was going to be recent. It was mainly that the previous research was done on subject groups, younger children, mainly primary students in the US as a whole, and I was focusing on high school students and high school students in South Louisiana, so it was a much smaller group. So my final results was that parental divorce affects the students negatively, their education negatively, but I also saw that there were different side effects that were leading to these academics becoming negative, and so different factors were leading to those academics being affected negatively. My directions for future research would be to increase my sample size because I looked at just high school students as a whole, and I focused on one local high school. So improving the sample size by maybe looking at more high schools in the parish would have been increasing my sample size so I could have got different results. And then having more time to do the survey, maybe if I had had longer time, I would have seen some more trends or I would have seen different things in the results.
All right, so Brody Babin is up next. Brody stepped into the debate around classroom technology with data and insight. His work examines the real-world effects of policy on student-focused learning and equity in our parish schools.
So my research paper was on an analysis of the phone ban in Louisiana Ascension Parish schools. And for context, the Senate Bill 207 is the unauthorization of the use of electronic telecommunication devices in Louisiana K-12 schools. And I conducted this study in Ascension Parish High Schools because of diversity in ethnicities, race, culture, gender, age, intellect, and socioeconomic statuses. So the main gap in this study I found when I was researching is that no other states in the US have this legislation to this extent like Louisiana does. So it was hard finding research on this topic before I started actually my paper because of this reason. And for the findings, so mostly from the qualitative data from the survey with the students is that it mostly indicated that academic performance was decreasing while the quantitative data from the survey found that GPAs increased slightly by 0.079, and also that stress anxiety increased. And this is important because stress and anxiety are two factors that can affect academic performance, because the more stress and anxiety that students have, the less likely they are to have good academic performance. And for the qualitative data from the teachers, I found that academic performance increased and that the teachers were split down the middle for stress and anxiety, because some said it had no effect at all, while other teachers said that taking away phones can make students feel left out and stress them out during tests and work. So my conclusion is that this data ultimately leads to the realization that the Senate Bill 207 is not having an overwhelming effect in its first year. And some directions for future research would be making the study more longitudinal, and that could have produced data that could have pointed to a more definitive conclusion, because more years and data from both before the ban was enforced and after the ban was enforced could have backed up the conclusion if it increased academic performance or decreased academic performance. And that's it.
So next up we have Peyton Harris. Peyton took on a topic that many shy away from, the end of life. Through careful, empathetic research, she illuminated how misunderstandings about hospice care affects families and what needs to change about how we talk about it.
My research presentation was titled "The General Public's Perception of Hospice in South Louisiana." While looking at past research, I noticed that most findings and studies already performed about hospice were on minority groups. For example, I found that a lot of them were in small case studies, such as specific hospitals, and a lot of the sources that I found were outdated. I found a total of 21 sources that went along with my research topic, and 8 of them were out of date. While my survey is more current and it asks a larger survey size. This led to my question: to what extent do the people in South Louisiana view hospice care as positive and ethical? Through a content analysis survey, I was able to gain insight from multiple different background groups and education levels, which went against my original hypothesis that education would impact hospice. It showed that education does not impact a person's perception of hospice, rather than more of a person's individual background and personal experience. It also showed me that the majority of people have a negative connotation on hospice. I asked a question that asked if a person thought hospice was positive or negative, and only 32% of participants said that they thought it was positive. I also found that a majority of participants thought it was ethical, which went against my original idea that if a lot of people thought it was positive, then a lot of people would also agree it was negative, not ethical. So even though a lot of people think that it is negative, over 90% of participants agreed that it was ethical. Some future implications for future research is that my research can be mass. I was only able to receive 206 participants for my research, while there are over 1 million people who live in South Louisiana, which means that my results can differ depending on the location. My research can also be more specific, looking at more specific population groups and other areas, creating more definite claims.
All right, next up we have Shelby. Shelby brought the science of psychology to the world of sports, exploring how belief and self-perception shape athletic outcomes.
All right, so my topic was on the correlation of mindset and athletic performance. The context to this was coming off of a pretty rough football season. Talking with coaching staff as well as athletes themselves, we found within our group we had a lot of egos on our team, a lot of people that brought different things that weren't necessarily positive to the locker room. And this could have great effects on our actual performance. This all led me to study this correlation between this performance and these mindsets that these kids have. My hypothesis was that the results will show the correlation exists and that it is prominent within high school athletes. In this body of knowledge, it has been found like they have researched college athletes as well as professional athletes. Not so much high school athletics. That's why I decided to research this area specifically. With this being the most developmental time for an athlete, this can be where they break out, where they find their love for a sport. And I found that it was really beneficial to have this information. These graphs determined that whenever I did do my research, the graphs that were found did determine that there was a very strong correlation between mindset and performance, and this mindset can differ between junior varsity and varsity players. Through thematic analysis, I was able to find that these results can differ even further through these players' emotions. With the statistical and multiple choice questions, they are only able to answer with a few options, but whenever they are able to fully express themselves, they differ even more. My limitations, pulling from a very small group, I was only able to pull from East Ascension, even though sending my research as far and wide as I could. Was only able to pull about 37 results, leading to the limitation that this can only be determined for this specific group of people. My conclusion that I found, once again, this correlation is prominent and it is there, especially during this time. And yeah, during high school, this is the most beneficial time to have this information. And for future research, they need to have more time, one, to get as many results as possible, get a larger sample size to make the answers more definitive and definite. And that's about it.
Next up, we have Matthew Michelli. Matthew tackled one of Louisiana's most urgent crises with bold interdisciplinary research. His work reveals how erosion isn't just environmental, it's economic, cultural, and political, and it's happening now.
Hi, my name is Matthew Michelli, and my research was an analysis of the erosion in the Mississippi Deltactic Plain in southern Louisiana and its effects on economics, culture, and politics of Louisiana. So pretty much what that's saying is, how does the erosion of Louisiana's coastline affect its residents? My gap is I focus on three of these variables, on each of these variables, economic, culture, and politics. And though each of these variables have been studied individually, they have not been studied overall with all three of them and how they interact. My results were that it was found that the CPRA, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, found that it would take $50 billion over 50 years to fix the coastline of Louisiana. And even though that does sound like a lot of money, and that's like, it's not as bad as it is face value, simply because there are economic advantages to saving the coastline. And another effect was the politicians. It was found that politicians in Louisiana aren't the best. And it lost, a lot of people in southern Louisiana don't have a lot of trust for their politicians. And I've pretty much given up hope on politicians fixing the coastal erosion. And then culturally, the land they live on is very significant to their culture because they see their land as their life. It's where most of them have been born, that's where they live, that's how they make a living. And if they're forced to move because of erosion, that could be detrimental to their culture. What this is pretty much saying is that there needs to be more investment by Louisiana and by its residents. They need to speak out more, they need to be heard more, there needs to be more capital invested into the coastline. And generally, politicians need to step up mostly for this problem to be fixed. Future research, one question that came up a lot was how aware are Louisianans, how aware are they of this problem? Because it really isn't known, no study has been done on how aware people are of their own problem. Obviously, if you live in southern Louisiana, you know about this erosion, but people in like, I don't know, Natchitoches, what do they know about it? And then bigger scale, just my study, just on a bigger scale with more time. I'm one person at a limited time, limited budget. I couldn't study or research everything I wanted to. And there's a lot more to be known and a lot more nuances to be explored. And that's it.
All right, next up we have Cameron Washington. Cameron investigated whether classroom technology needs more boundaries and if the statewide ban is helping.
Okay, so I was inspired by the recent cell phone ban for one. Students use their cell phones all the time in classrooms, and sometimes it might not be the best decision for them academically or for their future for their future. Some things that I already found in the research base were mentioning like students wanting to be in contact with their parents and the parents wanting to be in contact with them, especially in situations of violence and school shootings, etc. And then on the education side of that, I found through research that smartphones don't have a lasting impact on students' full ability to learn, and it serves more of like as a distractor. Some things that I didn't find that I aimed to solve with this research were how do people react to cell phone bans, such as the one that was instituted last August, the academic impact regarding not having cell phones by law, and how AI usage is affected by a cell phone ban. Some things I found were, for one, in my research, I asked, do they feel that it's necessary? Do they feel the cell phone ban was necessary for both teachers and students? And most of students agreed that no, it was not necessary, with 88.2% of students saying that the ban was not necessary. And most of teachers agreed in the opposite direction, that, that the ban was necessary for the students. Some findings that I had were between attitude and necessity. So people who had a positive reaction to the ban were saying that the ban was necessary. Between punishment and behavior, so people who perceive like a higher level of severity for punishment use their cell phone less in class. And between compliance and confiscation, so students who use their phone less in class reported lower levels of cell phone confiscation within their class. Some advice for future research would be to do physical examinations along a period of time through IQ tests, to determine any academic changes between their ability from before the ban and after the ban. Some natural observations, observing how often students would pull their phone out during class by teachers or a third-party administrator. And having a larger participant base, so the research can be generalized for a larger group of students and teachers. That's it.
And last but not least, we have Tyler. Tyler unexpectedly bridged education and industry, showing how handwriting, often dismissed as trivial, can have real-world consequences for safety and efficiency.
That's my name up there. And I researched the causes of poor penmanship and the effects it has on the performance of the Louisiana refinery and plant industry. Now, you wouldn't think that's a big topic. Like, I used to think my dad was backyard garden hose pipe fitter, but he's actually a millwright supervisor, so. But as you can see, it does have very big significance in Louisiana, and it's very local, like Geismar, Plaquemine, Baton Rouge. Many of those places have a lot of refineries and plants. You can see that there's $54 billion in economic trade and job benefits made in just Louisiana. And 1/6 of the nation's refining capacity is here in Louisiana. So, also from a medical history, just where there's chicken scratch in pharmaceutical settings where they've just messed up the handwriting. And it's really bad. Like, y'all know how the doctors are. Like, it's just terrible. But my gap was that there's nothing really on this in the body of knowledge, just the significance of Louisiana's refineries in there. And they don't really talk about the penmanship that can possibly have negative impacts. And so my hypothesis was that they could have negative impacts. And that raises the question, what negative impacts does it have? Sorry. But my findings did show that typically letters and abbreviations, most people understood that and they were written pretty proficiently. But sample G down there, that was a math equation. And you can see that there's a larger percentage of people who said no, that they can't understand that. Now, age proved to be pretty inconclusive because you can see there's somebody 65 all the way down. He was retired. I mean, dude probably can't see, but this does prove that math equations are significantly more likely to be less understood, and that can cause huge misunderstandings like measurements, amounts, results, things that need to be ordered. Now, while much of it is being switched to digital platforms and documentation, which that's a huge limitation, and also just my low participants, I only had 13 workers really respond to this. Like, I had them write samples, and then I put the samples into a survey where they answered that questionnaires based on the sample, and they read that. That's why I had the samples in that table. But many people did not answer because it's really hard to get to them and to reach that survey out to all of them. So low participation, people's ID departments were messed up with just Google accounts and everything. It was a lot, it was hard. And also a huge thing right here, the Privacy Act of 1964 and several other privacy acts that just made this research almost impossible. You would have to go to the Supreme Court and challenge them. I don't think anybody wants to do that for this. But the implication and improvements that can be made to this is a more widespread search and a larger survey team that would help reach out to all plant workers and refinery people, because then you'd get more of a population representation and you would find more results and variations in the things. I only found things such as eyesight impacting it. I didn't really ask if you were left-handed or right-handed, which I should have done on the sample forms. So that could be another improvement to the research method. But overall, there wasn't much. And future suggestions, pick a better topic, you know. This is really hard. But it did prove something that maybe we should practice our numbers whenever we want to go into the worker and refinery industry, and that it could have a catastrophic impact on things, such as maybe it blowing up or something. And that's about it. Thank you.
Okay, I have just a few people that I would like to say a special thank you to. They are on the back of your program, but I don't want to leave without mentioning their names. Specifically, Mr. Eric Brownfield, he has spent several days away from his own students as part of our review board that approved the kids' research. And as part of the presentation and oral defense committee, which took all day on a testing day. That I'm sure he had a million other things he could have done, but he was there and he set up the filming and everything to make sure that was all on the up and up so that I could submit all of that to College Board. Made my life so much easier. So thank you, Mr. Brownfield. He's back there. Of course, I want to thank EA administration, the other members of the presentation and oral defense panel, which is Mrs. Beth Dugas and Dr. Joanna Broussard, also our AP administrator, Ms. Dineska McZeal, our AP coordinator, Anastasia Terrio, Ms. Jody Elegar, and Taylor Lewis. And as we close tonight, I want to say this directly to my students. You've all done something extraordinary. In a world that often encourages shortcuts, you chose depth. You asked real questions, you listened to diverse voices, and created knowledge that didn't exist before you put in the work. You don't have to wait for college or a title to start making a difference. You already are. To the families and friends here tonight, thank you for supporting these students when the writing got hard, the questions felt overwhelming, and the deadlines came fast. You helped make this possible. To our administrators and school leaders and some of the other teachers that came here to support our students, thank you for believing in programs like AP Research and for creating a space for students to grow, not just in skills, but in voice. And finally, to my 12 researchers, your ideas matter, your voice matters. Keep asking questions. Keep being brave enough to seek those answers. You guys are true superheroes. Congratulations. This was drawn by Brody Babin. We did more than just research. But that's our whole class, represented as superheroes. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. There is cake. The first 12 pieces will go to my researchers here. Feel free to hang out and take some pictures and have some cake. Oh yeah. And y'all need to go sign the poster.